Thank you so much. It really is my honor to be here in this beautiful place with you. I suspect that maybe Eric and Sander wanted to come to Santa Cruz to go to the beach because the weather's a little different where I came from, but I can't think of a better place to get to be than here in this beautiful library with all of you. I've spent the last 15 years working in museums, libraries, cultural centers around community co-creation and participation. But that's not really what brought me fundamentally to this work. That started much earlier when I was a little girl. See, when I was a little girl, I had an entirely different dream. I wanted to work for NASA and become an astronaut. This was my hero. Hopefully she'll show up here in a minute. Yep, Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. When I was a kid, Sally Ride joined NASA, became an astronaut. I decided this was it. This was what I wanted to do. I pursued this dream through university, where I studied electrical engineering and math. Not so much typical background for a museum director, but I really believed that this is where I wanted to be. And it was not until I was in my first lecture in my chosen major of electrical engineering that I started to wonder if this dream that I had had since I was a little girl really belonged to me. You see, I was in a room about this size, although not quite so pretty. I had my graphing notebook. I was ready. It smelled like chalk in the air. And I watched as all of my classmates filtered in alongside me. There were about 200 of them. And they had something in common. They were all men. You see, in my program, like most electrical engineering programs then, like most electrical engineering programs in the US now, the program was 1% women in the undergraduates. Among faculty members and graduate students, there were no women. In fact, in all the time I spent in electrical engineering, I never met a woman engineer. I got through school, graduated with honors, and got that very first job at my dream place at NASA. And then I left that job just about 6 months later. On some level, I felt like I didn't belong. We've all had that feeling, right? That time when you look around and you suddenly realize how few of us there are and how many of them. Maybe some of you are having that feeling right now in this room today. That feeling of not belonging can be powerful. It's a feeling that led me to abandon a dream I'd had since I was a little girl. But it's also the feeling that drove me to this new dream, the dream that brings me here to be with all of you today, the dream that we can create places like this, where all kinds of people can feel like they belong. That dream took me eventually to becoming the director of this place, the Santa Cruz Museum of History, or as we call it, the MA. We were able to transform this institution from a dying traditional museum to a really vibrant community center. And I want to tell you just a little bit of that story. See, when I came to become its new director in May of 2011, it did not look like this. There was not this kind of energy going on. At the time, we had two really big problems. The first was money. We did not have any. The day I walked in the door as our new director, we had $16,000 in the bank, we had $36,000 in unpaid bills, and there was no magic check on the horizon. The board was talking about closing the doors of the museum. But in fact, we had a more serious problem than this financial problem, and that was a problem of relevance. There were more people in Santa Cruz at the time who knew that this building used to be the county jail than knew it was now a museum. And it had been a museum at this point for almost 20 years. And in the boardroom of a failing museum, this is the question people were asking. How can we get new people into this place? How do we get younger people? How do we get them not just to visit, but to become volunteers and members? How do we get them to be part of it? I understood this question, but it also made me uncomfortable. I realized I'd heard a version of this question before. I'd heard it 20 years before in university when people would ask this question: how can we get more girls into engineering? I've come to believe that these are the wrong questions to ask. I believe these questions lead us to lazy and judgmental answers. You know, in engineering, people would say things like this: maybe girls just aren't cut out for it. And in the museum, people would say things like this: maybe those people just don't appreciate culture. People have said these things to my face for years. we decided at the MA that we were going to ask new questions, not about them on the outside, but about us on the inside. We were going to ask, what are we willing to change to welcome new people here? What are we willing to change about how we work to help new people feel like they might belong? And so we started changing our museum, making it a welcoming place for all different kinds of people in our community. We became a fully bilingual organization, which surprisingly, there's not more of this happening in California, a state where a huge minority of people are coming from Mexico and Central America. We decided to, yes, keep focusing on art and history, but to make art and history the object and not the subject of the conversation. The subject is the people of our community who gathered together in the museum, who met new people at the museum, who connected with people across differences in age, in background, in race and identity, and a place where instead of just reading about the stories of somebody else who'd made history or art that somebody else had made, a place where you could make art and make history as well. Yes, we still had collections, we still displayed objects, but more and more often we were displaying objects like this, a collection of memories created by people in our community. Or an exhibition like this, an exhibition that we co-created with young people in care who are struggling to become adults without adults supporting them in their lives. These changes we made were not just philosophical or programmatic. They were business changes as well. I mentioned earlier, when I came in 2011, we had this shaky budget of $700,000 a year. We had 7 full-time staff at the time. We had 17,000 annual visitors, the majority of whom were older white folks and school children. Here's what this looks like for my final year at the museum, 2018. That year, we had a budget of $3 million, we had 40 full-time staff, and we had 148,000 visitors last year, and those visitors reflect the age diversity of our county, the income diversity of our county, and the racial ethnic diversity of our county as well. How do we do this? That's the question people always want to know. And so over the last couple years, we went searching in our own story for the answer. And when we found that it was very simple. We believe the MA is successful because it is of, by, and for its community. That means that our programs, our staff, our content, our board is representative of the community that we support, that our programs are created and co-created by our community, and that makes that organization welcoming for our community. When we saw this pattern at work, we started to realize we weren't just seeing this in Santa Cruz, we weren't just seeing this in museums, we were seeing it all kinds of community organizations around the world that were being successful connecting with new communities. They were doing it not just by focusing on the for side of the equation, trying to market to someone or create programming for someone. They were really doing more and more on the of and by side, thinking about empowerment, representation, and co-creation. And so we decided we wanted to meet some of these people around the world who were doing this work. And about a year ago, in May of 2018, we opened this website, Of, By, For All. And we thought this will be a place for practitioners around the world who are doing this kind of work to share knowledge and to build community and build skills. We expected it to be a small little side project of our museum, and we immediately discovered that that was a bad idea and that there was a huge amount of interest from around the world, enough interest and enough excitement, not just in talking about, but in really doing the work, that I decided to leave my safe job as a museum director and focus full-time on building this new global NGO focused on helping organizations become more of, by, and for their communities. If you go to the website, the first thing, or I'll just note, this is our mission to equip civic and cultural organizations to become of, by, and for their communities. We believe this benefits both the communities, whose voices are then empowered, and the organizations, which then become more relevant and more resilient. There are 2 sides to what we do. There's the website Of, By, For All and things like the boot camps that we do, which is about sharing the stories, sharing these methods. And then we have this thing called the Change Network, which is an intensive program for organizations that want to go deeper in really making change over time to do this work. The first thing we put up on the website is this self-assessment. Anybody can use it in about 5 to 7 minutes to get a sense right now of how your library is doing at being of, by, and for your community. If you get bored during the talk and you want to go to ofbyforall.org and do this, feel free. We've had about 2,500 people in 48 countries take the self-assessment. About 10% of those are from libraries. There are also a lot of museums, theaters, parks, cultural centers involved. And I'm going to share with you some of the data from what we're learning so far. So the first thing we're learning is that a lot of organizations are struggling with the same kinds of things that the Ma was struggling with. You know, one of the very first questions we ask on the self-assessment is this. We say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree, how much do you agree with this statement? Our organization welcomes people of all ages, backgrounds, and abilities. Here, the most common answer across those 2,500 folks and across all the libraries involved as well is a 5. So most people strongly agree with this statement. I see some nods, but also some questionable looks. And probably those questionable looks have to do with this next question we ask, which is this. Okay, on a scale again of 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, how much do you agree with this statement? Our patrons, our visitors, our participants reflect the diversity of our community. Here, the most common answer across 2,500 respondents is a 2. Disagree. I'm seeing nods, but how is this possible? How is it possible that we could be doing a great job welcoming people of all backgrounds, but people of all backgrounds don't feel welcome to come in the doors? I believe it's possible because saying that we're welcoming is not enough. Focusing on the for side of the equation is not enough. I believe that if we want to be successful, we have to also focus on the of and the by side. And by the way, if my mother ever asks you what she's doing with her engineering degree, you can say, it's okay, I saw some math of some kind up on a slide. She seems to be doing okay. But seriously, we feel like this is the formula for what we've seen be successful. That if you want to welcome new people, we have become so good, and especially libraries, on the for side, on building facilities that are accessible and welcoming and that have all kinds of amenities. But we have work to do and opportunities to grow in how we become more representative of the communities we want to serve and how we can co-create programs so that programs are created by the communities we want to serve. And today I want to share with you just a few stories of how some libraries around the world are doing this kind of work today. So first I want to take you very far from this building, but to another very beautiful library. Has anybody visited this library by any chance? We have one? Okay. Well, the rest of you, next time you're in Brisbane, Australia, you have budgets for this, right? Yeah. Do yourself a favor and visit the State Library of Queensland. I was lucky enough to be at the State Library of Queensland shortly after it opened. At the time, it was one of the most contemporary libraries in the world. White, gleaming, open plan, really incredible space. And I was there just after it opened as part of a group who were trying to add one more part that they had not opened with this brand new library. And that was an Indigenous knowledge center, or as they were calling it, a Curl-Duggan. See, that library in Queensland in Australia, as you probably know, there's quite a big population of Aboriginal Indigenous people, and the librarians wanted their library to be for Indigenous people as well. So, what do we do when we want to involve a community who we don't know a lot about? In my experience, what we usually do is we guess. We sit in our planning room and we say, oh, maybe they'll like this, maybe they'll like that. I like to say it's like planning a surprise party for people we don't know. And we're like, oh, we'll get this kind of music, we'll have this kind of food, it'll be great. And then what happens, right? We host the party, either they don't show up, or if they do show up, they're looking around saying, why did you get this kind of music and this kind of food, and why didn't you ask me what I might want? In the case of the State Library of Queensland, they decided, you know what, we're not going to guess. We're going to instead play on the other side of this equation, and we're going to use that to figure out what to put here. And so they created a community advisory group of Indigenous Aboriginal people so that the ideas for the programming and the facility of this Indigenous Knowledge Center would be created by people from that community. And I was lucky enough to be there at the first meeting of this community advisory group. So there we are in this brand new, gleaming white library, and there's librarians, and there's Aboriginal elders, and there's a couple designers like me. And the librarians say, okay, our mission here at this library is to share knowledge and build community, and we want to understand more about what that means for you. And the first thing the Indigenous elders said is, okay, the most important ways that we share knowledge are not really centered around books. They're centered around music and dance. It's intergenerational. And it's got to be colorful. It can't be so sterile like a hospital. And you could see these librarians looking around at their gleaming white space with new eyes. And then the Indigenous elders said, and the most important way we share knowledge is around a fire. This was a moment of truth. The librarians had to decide, were we for real when we said we wanted to involve Aboriginal people? Or were we secretly hoping that they would walk through the gleaming white doors that we've just opened and thank us for the privilege of doing so? And to their great credit, they were for real. And they took one of those white spaces and they made it a colorful space for families and music and dance. And even more impressively, they found an outdoor space where they built this fire pit so that groups like this Indigenous World Youth Congress could come meet at the library to share knowledge and build community, which is exactly what that library is about. Now, we all know that when you're building a new facility, it sort of seems like anything can happen. And in a lot of ways, what's even more impressive about what happened in Queensland was what happened after they opened the Indigenous Knowledge Centre. So because of the Indigenous Knowledge Centre, for the first time ever, they hired librarians who were Aboriginal, first in the Curl-Duggan, but then throughout the library. And they made sure that all the programs that they were creating in the Curl-Duggan were co-created by Aboriginal people. So that today, you have this space that is not just for Aboriginal people, but is continually and persistently of and by them, so that Aboriginal people feel welcome and feel as involved and supported in the library as other people in Queensland do as well. I want to focus for a moment just on the left side of this equation, on the of and the by. When we talk about diversity, we usually are focusing on the of side. We're talking about representation. Who's on our team? Who's on our board? And I just want to point out this is something that people all over the world are struggling with. We ask in the self-assessment, to what extent do you agree with the idea that your staff reflects the diversity of your community? Here, the most common answer is a 3, neither agree nor disagree. Public libraries in general are doing a little better at this than some of the other arts organizations that we work with. When we talk about boards, the most common answer is a 2, disagree. I would suggest to you, and I know you've heard it and you've been thinking about it, that this is a problem and it's an opportunity for growth. I imagine there are many conversations happening about who's in the room, who are the decision makers, who's on the staff. So I want to spend a moment instead on the other side of this, which is on the buy side, which I think we talk a little less about. I have found that one of the most powerful ways to find those future staff members and board members and partners is to start with partnership in community and to start with co-creation. Earlier I mentioned this incredible growth at the MA, where our attendance grew from 17,000 to 148,000 people per year and greatly diversified in who was coming. This growth is impressive, but it actually masks an even bigger change that made it possible, which was the number of partners we worked with annually. So when I came to the museum, we worked with about 50 partners a year to co-create our exhibitions and our programs. Within about 3 or 4 years, and this was with quite a small staff, we were up to working with about 2,000 people per year to co-create programming. I know, it sounds wild, right? You can't imagine having that many partners. But the reason we did it is because we saw again and again that the only way to change who was coming and how many of them were coming was to build relationships with trusted leaders in communities that we knew nothing about. And so just to put a finer point on this, mathematically, to get an 8.7x growth in attendance, we had to have a 40x growth in who we were partnering with. And the reason why was this. We didn't matter if we had the best program idea in the world for a particular community. If that community didn't trust us, didn't know us, they weren't going to show up or they weren't going to have a good experience. And we found again and again that it was by partnering with somebody who was trusted in a community that we would understand better how to stop guessing and how to build a better program. And also they would be the ones to tell their community, this is legit, this is going to be great, you should come. So you might wonder, who are these 2,000 partners? Well, of course, as a museum, we worked with artists, but we also worked with some people you might not expect a museum to work with. We did a huge archiving project with a group of midwives from the mountains who led a whole project around birth stories and home births in our community. When we did a big exhibition project around surfing and the birth of surfing in North America, of course we partnered with surfers, but we also partnered with this Polynesian biker club and with other groups that were connected to the story, not through the sport, but through cultural legacy and heritage. We work with most of our partners on a one-off basis for a given exhibition or program, but we also work with some partners throughout the whole year. So this is our version of a community advisory group. It's called C3, the Creative Community Committee. Every other year, we would convene a group of 50 to 100 people in our community who cared about a big issue. So this was from a year where we were focused on divisions between whites and Latinos in our community. We did a year that was focused on children in care and foster youth. We did a year that was focused on senior citizens struggling with social isolation. But we would bring together all different kinds of leaders around an issue so that they could not only talk with each other and work on projects that would live at the museum, but so that they could build partnerships beyond the museum as well. I look at this picture and I see politicians, I see a librarian, I see tech workers, I see farmers, artists, all kinds of people who are networked in different communities and who are able to bring those networks and their experience to the conversation. So that when we built a project, an event series, a film series related to farm workers, we knew that farm workers would come because it was co-created by them. And when we did something related to technology and divides, we were working with technologists, so we knew they would come. Even as our museum became more and more popular, it was always our partners that drove what was possible. And I see that this is something we see in the self-assessment that really stands out about the MA, and it's something I really want to invite you into. So we ask on the self-assessment this question, roughly what percentage of your public programs are co-created by community partners? At our museum, the number was like 90 to 100%. But around the world, we see that this is not the case. Around the world, the most common answer for those 2,500 organizations is 10 to 50%. But I've got to tell you that for libraries, the most common answer here is 0 to 10%. I was very surprised when I saw this at first about libraries. I think of libraries as really wonderful, civic, democratic spaces. And as I started to spend more time with librarians, what I heard was a very big focus on professionalism and on this idea of what is a library quality program. And this sense that if we can't produce something with our expertise and to our level of professionalism, then it's not a good idea for us to do. And I would suggest to you that there are people in your community with other kinds of expertise, other kinds of professionalism, and certainly other kinds of community connections that you don't have, and that there's a huge opportunity to explore how to co-create with them, how to get this number up, so that you're not just saying, we want to be for this new community, we're going to do outreach to them, but instead saying, we respect your expertise, your creative skills, the stories you have, and we want to create a program that amplifies and puts you in front, even if it looks different from what a library quality program might be. So when you think about how this comes together, you know, a lot of people, I'm very practical, so I like to know how do we do it. So I want to share with you a little bit of the process we use with this thing called the Change Network I mentioned earlier. The Change Network is a program for organizations that have said, we're ready to make a year-long commitment, committing a team to doing this kind of work. We're working with 47 organizations in 9 countries right now. There's only one in the Netherlands, the Stedelijk Museum in Schiedam, but there are 5 that are public libraries. They're all in the U.S. right now. I would love for the second Netherlands organization to be a public library. I'll just say it here. But I want to share with you the process we're taking these organizations through, because I find a lot of us get excited or inspired around these issues of inclusion or diversity, but then when it gets very practical, especially you're all busy managers and directors, for me the concrete how is really valuable. So here's our process. We say the first thing you need to do is assess your readiness. Is your organization ready to make this kind of change? And that doesn't mean you need to have every single person excited about this. It means you need to have a small team, maybe it's 2, 3, 4, 5 people within your library who are ready to devote time and resources to doing work in a new way, to practicing new ways of working, and have some leadership support for doing it. For organizations that are ready, we always say the first thing to do is to create a vision of what that ultimate goal it looks like. What do you want your change to look like? And we phrase it this way. We say, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, if you have the best possible outcome in terms of community involvement, what does it look like? Who's coming to the library? Who are you partnering with? What's the experience in the building like? How is your work different 5 to 10 years from now? I know there are a couple people here who are coming to one of these boot camps in the next couple weeks. We're going to do this right away on the first day, so you can bring your notebook and your pen. And then we say, okay, zoom in. You have this big vision. Now pick just one community who you haven't involved very well, who you're interested in, and who you think is critical to that eventual success. And then once you've selected that community, once you get really specific about who they are, then you can go out and get to know them. You can go spend time in their community spaces. You can meet leaders in that community so that you really start to understand how to move from guessing to real partnership. And then once their voices are in your head, you can make a plan and you can start to make some really concrete changes. So I want to give you one example of what this looks like in a library, a public library that's been involved in this in Indiana. So this library is in South Bend, Indiana. They wrote a vision and they said, our vision 5 to 10 years from now is that everybody in our community has a stake in the library, and if the library is threatened, many different kinds of people in our community are coming to the aid of the library. And they realized that a community, when they zoomed in, a community they had not been engaging much was the growing Latino community in their county. So increasing number of people moving, not so much from Mexico, more from Guatemala and Honduras, but coming to South Bend, Indiana. And they said, you know what, we do some programs that we know some people are coming to, but we haven't really thought about this community in a serious way. And so we said, great, the Latino community in your county is big. Can you get more specific? And they said, we're going to focus on people on the west side of South Bend, and we're going to focus on Latino artists in particular, because we see that there's an opportunity around some of the workforce development stuff we do. We think the library can help them, and we think they can help us. And so the first thing they learned when we said, great, go to the west side, go spend time there. Figure out where artists are hanging out, who's a leader in this world, what does it look like? And of course, you know, in a new immigrant community, it's not like there's the Latino Art Museum or the Art Center that you go to. What they found were a lot of places like this, murals. So people who were doing street art, people who were getting together in weaving groups or music groups. So they started to make connections with some of these informal groups. They started also internally in their library to identify who are the staff who could be critical to doing this work. And one of the things they realized was that their security team was actually most commonly the person you first met coming into the library, and they were people who didn't have another job like reference at the desk. They actually could engage with people. So they started working with and really recruiting security staff. They started all taking basic Spanish, which was amazing, but just also building relationships in the neighborhood. They started transforming some of their long-standing programming. So this is, you know, story time. For the first time, they started doing story time in Spanish and also using books that were recommended by some of the partners they've made from Guatemala and Honduras. And they also started some programs that were very specific to what they were hearing. One of the things they heard from their community of interest was, we have a real value on community and home, but we've been uprooted in coming here. So they created a project together that was about creating places of home and community identity out throughout the West Side. They did this in partnership with artists. And so they started doing a lot of things. And then what was interesting was that just 9 months into this process, one of their greatest fears happened. The county of South Bend put forward a proposal to cut the library's budget by 20% to put the money into this emergency services issue. And the library freaked out. This was just a couple months ago, and they needed to mobilize their people. So of course they had their long-standing members who showed up, who wrote letters, things like that. But they found that when they did the protests, they also, for the first time, had people coming from the West Side and from the Latino community. And actually some of the posters from the protests were made by some of those Latino artists who they'd started to work with. And so they saw, even within the span of less than a year, that they were starting to matter to new people. And as you can probably tell from what this story is, this is the newspaper article where the county dropped the plan to remove the library funding because the library had demonstrated it had so many stakeholders who cared about its future, and not just their long-standing stakeholders, but new stakeholders as well. This is me with the director of the library, Deb Futa. I was there a couple weeks ago for their all-staff. They have a costume contest as part of their all-staff, something you might want to consider. But I love this both because obviously I love NASA, I love space, but Deb really said, you know, she feels like of, by, for all, and the work that they're doing now with their community, she believes it's the future of public libraries, that it's uncharted territory, that it's scary, but that we have to be willing to go there. So I think you can probably tell why I'm so passionate about this, and I hope that some of you are feeling energized about it as well. Before we open it up to questions, I want to give 3 really specific ideas of what you might be able to do next. So the first is to, try the self-assessment. Go to ofbyforall.org. We have a lot of free resources there as well, some toolkits for things like how to do respectful audience demographic surveying, how to have a first meeting with a partner. But we're finding that this assessment has been really helpful for a lot of organizations in getting started. Again, if you get bored during the Q&A, just go ahead. I will say that a lot of people do this self-assessment and then they email me and they say, I did it and then I got very depressed because we got a very low score. And I say to them, that's great. You got a lot of room to grow, I didn't quit my job as a museum director because we were all doing this so well. It's because I believe that we have a lot of opportunity to build these new skills. Everybody in this room has really incredible professional skills that you've built up over your career, important skills to be proud of. What I'm inviting you to do is to consider adopting and learning and flexing and practicing some new skills around community organizing, around networking, around co-creation, and we want to help you do that. If you're interested in really getting help to do it, you could consider the Change Network program. We'll be opening up new spots in the spring, and we're really excited to keep supporting organizations that want to do this, not just for a day or a weekend, but for a year or for years to come. And I want to give you 2 more options. This one is a little more abstract. This is for any academics in the room. And it's about the idea of how we define community. So I mentioned earlier that we challenge every organization we work with to really specifically define the community they're going to involve, like those Latino artists on the west side of South Bend. These are some examples of some other communities that organizations have chosen. The first one is actually, and that sheet is from the public library in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, Dakota County Library. Minnesota has had a lot of refugee immigrants come, and they initially said, we want to work with our refugee population. And we said, that's very big. Can you get more focused? We want to work with our Somali population. That's very big. Can you get more focused? And they said, okay, we're going to focus on this neighborhood, Burnsville, where we know there are a lot of Somali people living. And we're going to focus on moms with kids under 5 because we believe that those moms both are decision makers for their families and that we have some existing programming that could be a good fit. Maybe we can work with them to morph those programs to be more effective. We find that when you focus on a very specific community, it allows you, A, to think about these as people and not as abstractions, and B, it allows you to really get to know folks so that you can actually change those surprise parties into things that are co-created and really work for them. A lot of organizations, though, get very stressed out by this. And they say, how can we pick just one community? We're in a huge city. We're a national organization. We can't, it's not politically expedient or even proper for us to pick just one community. The other concern that often comes up is this one, where people will say, this isn't fair, because if you're going to focus on this community, it means you're not focusing on this other community. So I want to offer you a framework for thinking about and getting okay with the idea of going deep with one community. And it's this idea about equity that's put forward by Dr. John Powell called targeted universalism. And so here's the argument, that if you think about the world of all these different communities that are out there, there are a couple of different approaches we typically take for strategies to service many different kinds of communities. A very common one is what's called a universal strategy, where we say we are going to create a strategy for everyone. Libraries tend to work this way. We say the library is for everyone, and these programs are for everyone, and we don't care who you are, everyone can get a card, everyone can come to these programs and use these services. Universal programs tend to be very politically popular. It's for everyone. That sounds very fair. But it also, in practice, universal strategies tend to work better for some people than others, and some people are left out of the everyone. It has to do with that thing about who's coming in the door. So that's universal strategies. The alternative is what's called targeted strategies, where you say, we're going to pick a specific community and we're going to create a specific pathway and opportunities for them. Targeted strategies tend to work very well, but they're also often very politically unpalatable because they're seen as very unfair. In my country, affirmative action, we've been fighting over it for 40 years because there's a sense that it's not fair to create an opportunity for a particular person and not for somebody else. So what Dr. John Powell has put forward with this idea of targeted universalism is this. He says, think about having a universal goal and targeted strategies. So let's say the goal is that the library is for everyone. And then you look and you say, who is already using the library? Who's already part of that for everyone? And who isn't? And for the people who aren't, let's create some targeted strategies specific to those communities to welcome them into this big goal. So it's not about, I'm doing something for you that I'm not doing for you. It's that what are the different strategies needed so that everybody can have whatever the goal is. So I offer this to you in case this kind of academic argument is useful to you. If you're interested, you can look up targeted universalism. There's a lot written about it as a policy approach, and we've found it to be helpful in focusing on specific communities. But the last thing I want to offer you is much more conceptual, much more personal, and something that everybody could walk out of here doing. And that's to think about how you can spend less time creating programs and more time making space for others to create them. And this idea was one that I learned about first from a person named Beck Tench, who's now a digital librarian. And Beck was hired years ago by an institution and told that her job was to bring digital culture to this organization, and that her job was to take risks, and that if she didn't take risks, she wasn't doing her job. She was excited, but she was also terrified. And she realized very quickly she needed somebody else, she needed her boss to be a spacemaker for her, to give her not just the title, not just the salary, but the space to actually take risks and fail without feeling like this was an impossibility. Beck was lucky. She had a really great boss. She started taking risk after risk, doing project after project. But then she started to realize, wait a second, I was told that my job here was to change the culture of this organization to be more digital, and that's not going to happen with me doing one project after another. And Beck realized that to be successful, she in turn had to become a space maker for others. I think about this all the time as somebody who spent the first part of my career identifying very heavily as a risk taker. I'm identifying as somebody where my ego and my pride was based on the idea that I had tried, I had experimented, I had made the thing. And when I became a museum director, I started to shift and I started to realize, the way we can make this big vision possible is not going to be based on me taking risk after risk, making space for myself. It's going to be based on me making space for our staff, our volunteers, our community members to bring forward their creativity, their ideas, their stories, their projects. And the more I can be a space maker for them, the further we can go. And so I want to invite you to think about being a space maker and to join me in thinking about these few questions. What would it look like if libraries really were of, by, and for everyone? Whose voices would we hear? Who would feel welcome? What could we accomplish together? I believe this is possible, and I believe it could change the way our organizations are valued and are sustainable in today's world. So I hope you'll join me in making this real, and I thank you for your time today.